like to invite my colleague Annalise Acorn to introduce our speaker.
I have a very short time to make this introduction, which is okay because it's not going to take very long for you to get the picture. Chrystia Freeland was born in Vancouver, Alberta. Both her parents graduated from this law school. She went to Old Scona Academic High in Edmonton, and then Harvard and Oxford. She has risen to become one of the most influential and well-respected editors, authors, journalists in the world. Chrystia's book, Plutocrats, that she'll be speaking to us about today, made the New York Times bestseller list. She is the editor at Thomson, Reuters Digital. She is a frequent commentator on CNN. She periodically stands in for Arianna Huffington on a radio program called Left, Right, and Center. And the one that inspires real visceral envy in me is that she has twice been a guest of Stephen Colbert on Colbert Report. The turnout today speaks for itself. Ladies and gentlemen, Chrystia Freeland.
I'm really glad that we started this afternoon by talking about the scholarship and acknowledging winners. I think one of the great, and we're also talking about Alberta and the builders of our province, and one of the great things about our province is education and scholarships and support for students here. I've benefited hugely from Alberta scholarships, and I'm delighted the next generation is still benefiting. I think it's how we educate people for our province, and we give Albertans a platform for the rest of the world. So congratulations, young women. We expect great things of you. It's great to see so many people here. I have a tip, though, for the U of A organizers of events like this. You should invite people to speak who have a very big family and a lot of family friends. Because I really feel I am related to or have been babysat by at least half of the people in this hall, which is a great pleasure. I do want to thank probably the oldest person here, my great uncle, Mr. Blavatsky. He's 93 years old, and he's sitting here, and I'm delighted he's here. Pleasure for me to be here at the U of A Law School. I didn't, in sort of my first opportunity to disappoint my parents, go to U of A Law School myself as an adult, but I consider myself to be actually more at home here than at any place on earth, because I was born while my parents were at the U of A Law School. In those days, you were allowed to bring your children anywhere you wanted, so I attended quite a few lectures. And apparently, the library was a place I often slept. So this really is as much my home as any place on earth, and it's great to be here. So now I'd like to talk to you a little bit about my book. As Annalise said, my book was published in October, and I've done quite a few interviews and quite a lot of media around it. And one of the questions that I found I was being asked quite often, which initially really annoyed me, but I came to welcome, was, come on, why write about the rich? Surely the rich have always been with us. What's the point of this? And it annoyed me because it seemed so obvious to me that there was a new point to make, and that's why I wrote the book. I came to welcome the question because it gave me the chance to make that. And the point really is that things have really changed. They've changed very dramatically over the past 30 years. And that change is marked in the Western industrialized countries, most pronounced in the US and Britain, but pretty significant in a place like Canada too, and in Northern Europe. You're seeing it in the emerging markets as well. And what we've really seen is this surge in income inequality, with particularly the gap growing between the very top and everybody else. And it actually took a while for economists to notice it, because economists were used to looking at the top decile or the top quintile, and they weren't really measuring what was happening at the very, very top. But as they looked at it more closely, they really see more and more of the action, more and more of the concentration is in the top 1% or even in the top 0.1%. So to give you a couple of figures to sort of place that in historical context, in the 1970s, and I'll talk a little bit about the United States, the top 1% of the income distribution took 10% of the national income. Today, that number is up to between 20 and 25%, depending on the year. So from 10% to 20 to 25%, and the 70s, they're not that long ago. I'm not a young kid, but I'm not ancient, and I remember the 70s. That's a big shift. The even bigger shift is in the very, very top. So the top 0.1%, the top 10th of the 1%, today in the U.S. accounts for roughly 8% of the income. The top 10% of the 1% is pretty close to where the 1% was 30 years ago. That's a really big shift. To give you another way of looking at it, if you take the income of two admittedly really rich people, Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, if you take their wealth, so talking about wealth rather than income, Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, their wealth is equivalent to the wealth of the bottom 40% of the U.S. population, 120 million people. Warren Buffett himself actually talks about this, and Annalise spoke about Colbert, so in keeping with that idea that comedians are our best source of information in the modern world, I'm going to quote from a Warren Buffett interview with Jon Stewart a couple of months ago. And Warren Buffett has really sort of focused on this issue too. He likes to talk about how he says, there is a class war and my class is winning. And the figure which Warren Buffett cited talking to Jon Stewart was looking at the Forbes 400 list. That's the 400 richest Americans. In 1992, the combined wealth of those top 400 Americans was $300 billion. In 2012, it had quintupled, increased fivefold to $1.7 trillion. And we all know that that didn't happen to the level of the American middle class family. The way Warren Buffett describes this, and I think it's just a great term, is he says this huge gap has kind of crept up on us. He says it's snuck up on us. We don't really notice it, but it's there, and it's a very big, both consequence of the economic forces around us and something which is shaping our political economy. I sold this book. I got a deal with a book publisher in September 2008. And if you think back to September 2008, you will remember that was kind of a momentous month in recent history. Momentous, for me, because I had this book deal, partly, and then the crash happened. And I really thought that that was it. I couldn't write my book because it seemed to me self-evident that this was the end of this super financial bubble. Those super returns at the top were going to be over. There was going to be a huge social and political backlash. That I felt like, okay, I've just got the book deal and now the plutocracy is over. And I was so convinced of that, I actually wrote a whole new book proposal. It was going to be called Survivors, and it was going to be talking about this different, new, completely transformed world. But then, surprisingly shortly after that, cataclysmic moment that really plunged so much of the world into recession, and so many people lost their jobs because of it, I started to see that actually nothing really had changed. And those trends that I had noticed before 2008 were still there. And in fact, the data bears that out. So one of the economists whose work I draw on heavily, who is probably sort of the leading data jock of income distribution, especially at the very top. He's one of the guys who started looking beyond the top decile at the top 1%, is a French economist at Berkeley, a guy called Emmanuel Saez. And every year he updates a data series on upper end incomes. So in March of last year, just as I was finishing my book, he updated what was happening in the income recovery, because there actually was one in the US in 2009-2010, and it turns out it was a 1% recovery. In that period, 93% of the income gain went to the top 1%. And even more strikingly, the top 0.01%, so the really, really thin slice, they accounted for 1/3 of the entire economic recovery, to the tune of about 4.2 million per household. SIAS has updated that data set for 2011. It's always a year back, so it's now 2009 to 2011. And he's actually found that the recovery in that period, about 116% of that recovery went to the 1%. Mathematicians here will say, hey, how can they get more than 100%? And that's because in the 99% in the US over that period, incomes actually declined. So, you know, the trends haven't changed, and in some ways are intensifying. I've been talking a lot about the United States, but one of the points that I think is really important to think about in thinking about what's going on is that this is a shift which is really significant in terms of actually all of human history, and it's a global phenomenon. And a nice little vignette to illustrate this comes from the work of another economist who I cite, a guy called Branko Milanovic. He's an economist at the World Bank, originally from what was still Yugoslavia, now in Washington. And Branko did, a few years ago, he had this kind of fun idea for an economics paper, which was to set out to find who is the richest person who ever lived. We're in a university, so I'm sure there are many, I was going to say pedantic academics. That's a very bad thing to think that. How about detail-oriented, precise scholars here? And those of you who fall into that category will immediately think, but how can you compare wealth across centuries and millennia? How do you compare owning a slave with owning a private jet? Branko has a PhD too, so he thinks about that. And the metric he came up with is to compare how many days of labor of your compatriots would your wealth buy. That's kind of the currency he uses. And it's a very fun paper for people academically inclined. He sort of talks about the Roman patricians, he does some of the Renaissance princes, he talks about the American robber barons. But he concludes that the richest person who has ever lived in all of human history is Carlos Slim, the Mexican billionaire. So I think that says something really interesting about how global this phenomenon is, and really how extreme it is, even compared to other periods of time, which I think we tend to assume were much less egalitarian than our own sort of middle-class democracy. So one of the things we're thinking about, and I'm going to cite Branko, is, you know, why do we not think about this? Why do we not focus on this? And Branko made a really interesting point, and he put it so well that I'm going to read you his quote. On income inequality, on this concentration at the very top, on how we frame the discussion. Branko said, I was once told by the head of a prestigious think tank in Washington, D.C., that the think tank's board was very unlikely to fund any work that had income or wealth inequality in its title. Yes, they would finance anything to do with poverty alleviation, but inequality was an altogether different matter. Why? Because my concern with the poverty of some people actually projects me in a very nice, warm glow. I am ready to use my money to help them. Charity is a good thing. A lot of egos are boosted by it, and many ethical points earned, even when only tiny amounts are given to the poor. But inequality is different. Every mention of it raises, in fact, the issue of the appropriateness or legitimacy of money. So this is a question in some ways about economic data and what's happening in the economy, but it is very politically freighted and very politically weighted and sensitive. I found very quickly, as I was writing my book, that when you asked economists that question, it was a really good way to figure out what their political biases were. If you asked economists on the left, their preferred explanations were very much around the politics, around falling taxes, around economic deregulation, around the declining power of unions, around a culture which is more open to very high CEO compensation. When you ask economists whose biases lean more towards the right, you find them leaning much more on the economic explanations. So they tend to talk about how this is all about globalization, this is all about the technology revolution, it's all about sort of winner-take-all spirals that those set off. I personally, in looking at it, really think that it's both. And it's going to be a very weak analysis if you try to look at a couple of these. A reason that I really think you can't leave out those underlying economic forces is that this is a phenomenon we're seeing all over the world. And so one of the things I do find quite amusing about some of the US debate about this is you'll have people say, well, it was that particular legislative change in the United States that created income inequality. And I'll say, you know, the US isn't the only country in the world, gentlemen. And actually Canada didn't have that change, and Britain didn't have that change, and they have income inequality going up too. So I think that's one reason to really feel that the economic forces are powerful drivers. And I think it's also important to understand that there's a feedback loop between them. So as the economic forces gather steam, I think you see the political drivers of income inequality get stronger, because the economic forces are creating some interests that really think that these processes are terrific, and they're able to push the politics further in that direction. And the other thing that I think is important to really realize, and the reason why, you know, it can be tempting to underweight those economic forces, because those economic forces are actually generally benign. I mean, who is opposed to the technology revolution? It's created such wonderful things. It's enriched all of our lives. And to think about it having difficult social consequences is an idea we don't want to have. The political explanations, although obviously politically hard to deal with, intellectually are no-brainers. You know, I've talked to a lot of these plutocrats. No one said to me, I support crony capitalism. You know, no one said, I am a robber baron and I like it that way. Everybody is in favor of free, open, transparent capitalism with equal opportunity and open rules of the game. And I think, you know, obviously I'm looking here at Anne Fung, you know, politically getting to that is hard. But achieving an intellectual consensus around the idea that we want a system free of crony capitalism, I think, you know, you get 100%. And why I emphasize that is I think even if we could achieve that nirvana, I think that there are underlying economic forces which are just transforming our society and we need to really start thinking about. I talked to Larry Summers about this, and he agreed with me. And he said, you know, look, I don't think, if you look at the impact of the technology revolution and globalization, he said, I don't think that the danger is structural unemployment. You know, if you let market forces work, people will have jobs. But he says the question is, maybe the kind of jobs we'll be talking to our children about are, do you specialize in cleaning the deep end or the shallow end? And my dystopian version of that is, again, imagining this sort of hypothetical utopia with no crony capitalism, perfect competition, perfect opportunity. You could still imagine that it would turn out to be a world where there are a few brilliant geniuses who invent Google and Facebook, and the rest of us give them massages. So who are the people who we will be massaging, and whose deep and shallow ends we will be cleaning? Who are the plutocrats? A few important characteristics. One is, and I'm talking now especially about the very top, this is actually a largely self-made meritocratic elite. This is not the world of Downton Abbey. It is not largely inherited wealth. There's some of that there. And if you wish to be a plutocrat, it helps very much to be born into an affluent, upper middle class family that can give you a great education. But most of these people have actually built the businesses that created their fortunes. And there's a recent study done at the University of Chicago, again looking at the Forbes rich list, the Forbes 400. And they compared 1982 with 2011. And they found that in 1982, just 40% of those 400 richest Americans had built their own business. In 2011, that number had gone up to 69%. And I do want to emphasize, this is not, this is not pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. Bill Gates counts in that 69%. He grew up, he was very affluent family, extremely well educated, but he built Microsoft. He didn't inherit that from his dad. So that's a very important characteristic, and as I'll discuss, that really shapes the worldview of this group in some paradoxical ways, some ways that were surprising to me. Another thing about them is, I call it the rise of the alpha geeks, because they're very good at risk, they're very good at navigating moments of change, moments of creative disruption, the new technological change, in the emerging markets, moments when the political system totally transforms. But they're also really geeks, right? This is the age of, numeracy reigning supreme. And I hope all the lawyers here also have degrees in computer science or math or physics, because that's really sort of the dominant skill set. And that maybe makes sense when you think about, okay, of course the Silicon Valley guys, of course the Wall Street, City of London guys, but it's also true of the emerging markets guys. So you think of a Russian oligarch and you probably think of, some guy with, a bevy of supermodels on one arm and, some gangster-like looking bodyguards with machine guns on the other arm. And this is in fact true. But that guy also probably has a PhD in math or physics. Remarkable how many of that early group of oligarchs did. It's true of the Indians and of the Chinese, who have really technical engineering and mathematical educations. And then the final quality, which I think is really important in shaping of the world view, is this is becoming a truly global group. Largely, I think, driven by the flows of their capital, the flows of their money, the flows of their business. These are people who hang out with each other around the world, who have in really meaningful ways sort of slipped the traces of the nation state. They don't live in a particular country anymore. There are sort of two plutocrat buildings, one on 57th Street in New York and one in London at 1 Hyde Park. And the sort of cheapest apartments in them sell for about $50 million. And how you know that these are the buildings inhabited by the global plutocracy is the actual occupancy rate is about 25%. So these are people who own $50 million apartments, several of them, and they can only be in one at a time. To give you a sense of how they think of themselves in this sort of global world, I'd like to quote a conversation I had with one of them, a guy called Glenn Hutchins. And Glenn is the co-founder of Silver Lake, a private equity firm that specializes in technology. He was in the news recently because Silver Lake has teamed up with Michael Dell in that bid to take Dell private. And I talked to him about this, and this is what Glenn told me. A person in Africa who runs a big African bank and went to Harvard Business School has more in common with me than he does with his neighbors. And I have more in common with him than I do with my neighbors. Beijing can look a lot like New York. You see the same people, you eat in the same restaurants, you stay in the same hotels. We are much less place-based than we used to be. And what I found so revealing about that conversation is actually Beijing does not look like New York. I mean, you don't have to be a billionaire or have a PhD, but I can guarantee, any of us walked on a street in New York and a street in Beijing, and not told which city we were in, could quite quickly figure it out. But actually, if you live in this plutocracy, they really are the same. They stay in exactly the same hotels. They all stay in the Four Seasons. Good Canadian business, catering to plutocrats. They even have the same menus, right? They go around the world. They probably have the same room service menus. And then they go down for breakfast or lunch or supper. They see exactly the same people, whether they are in Beijing or New York or London or Mumbai. So what is their relationship to the rest of us? What impact are they? How do they think about us? What impact are they having? And this is really a complicated question. On the one hand, partly I think because of these meritocratic roots of the plutocrats, they don't have this sense of being an aristocracy with a separate culture and behaviors. They do feel like they're like everybody else. So to give you an example of this sentiment, Bill Gates gave a talk at MIT in April 2010. And one of the students there, and I really admire this kid, asked the question that I'm sure was in the minds of everybody, which is, what is it like to be so rich? And this is what Bill Gates said. Well, the marginal return for extra dollars does drop off. I haven't found any burgers at any price that are better than McDonald's. After a few million or something, it's all about how you're going to give it back. So, from the Bill Gates view, actually not very much of a difference between him and us. I talked to Eric Schmidt at the time he was the CEO of Google about this also. And I went to see him in his office in Mountain View at Google. And the first thing that really struck me was it was not a big office. Probably from that desk there, maybe to the middle of that desk there, and from this wall, maybe to those desks. A modest office. I'm sure the professors at the U of A Law School, actually all of you have bigger offices than I feel good about that. And then I get into the office and there's a whiteboard with lots of equations on it, right? Super geeks. And I will reveal to you a secret about journalists, which is we believe it is often effective to butter up the person you are interviewing. So, as sort of an introduction to the conversation with Eric, I started by saying, Eric, wow, you have all these equations on your whiteboard. Isn't that amazing? You're the CEO, but you're still, fixing the algorithm. You're still in the weeds, working in the business. And he said to me, oh, I didn't write these equations. The engineers on the floor must have written them. Because here he is, CEO of one of the biggest, most successful companies in the world, has not a big office, and he shares that office with everybody on the floor. Anyone who feels like it, if he's not in the office, can go walk into Eric's office and use his whiteboard. So really kind of, this powerful egalitarianism. And I talked to Eric about it, and he said, and also, by the way, culturally we are not allowed to have drivers for our cars. So he says, whereas in other cultures, you can drive your Rolls Royce around and just sort of look rich and have a really good time. In technology, it's not socially okay to have a driver who drives you to work every day. I don't know why, but you'll notice nobody does it. Interestingly, the private jet is social. And then, there's the problem of you're all Googlers, but you also have people who are not sort of quite Googlers, but who are working in your office, like cleaning, wiping up the whiteboard at night and cleaning the bathrooms and stuff. So how do you deal with that? Are they part of the egalitarian universe too? And this is what Eric said to me. Many tech companies solve this problem by having the lowest paid workers not actually be employees. They're contracted out. We can treat them differently because we don't really hire them. The person who's cleaning the bathroom is not exactly the same sort of person. I find it sort of offensive, but it's the way it's done. So already that egalitarianism and we're all the same starts being kind of sliced and diced a bit. Another kind of insight into that relationship to the rest of us that started to come through very strongly for me was in the aftermath of the financial crisis. And I started talking to the finance guys about, what had caused it. And I sort of initiated these conversations with real trepidation because I didn't want to ask a hurtful question. It sort of felt like talking to someone about a divorce, sort of a painful, shameful thing that happened to them. Because I thought they would feel guilty about it. I should not have worded. So one guy who I talked to, who's the CEO, he is still the CEO of one of the leading Wall Street investment banks. He sort of very delicately said, so, the financial crisis, do you feel maybe a little bit guilty? Did your bank play a role in causing it? And he said, absolutely not. The person to blame for the financial crisis was his cousin. It was like a middle-class guy in Brooklyn, and who owned 3 cars and a house he could not afford with one of the notorious subprime mortgages. I asked another guy, this is a private equity guy, he has a home in Palm Beach and a home in New York, one of the pioneers of the leveraged buyout whole idea, and asked him the same question, and he said, I also know exactly who caused the crisis. It was his golf caddy in Arizona, who, a golf caddy, but owned 3 condos. And he said, when he told me he's got 3 condos, I knew it, he caused the financial crisis. That's it. In a sort of similar vein, there is a different perspective on, what I see as the other side of the economic coin. So these economic forces of globalization, technology revolution, political, economic liberalization, privatization, all that stuff, that package of things that on the one hand is creating the plutocrats, is also hollowing out the middle class. And they know that. And so I talked to some of them about it. One of them, and this is a hedge fund manager based in Greenwich, but he's actually Scandinavian, so as sort of an example of his social liberal antecedents. And I moderated a dinner speech that he gave in New York. And during the speech, he observed that the low-skilled American worker is the most overpaid worker in the world. And he was sort of sad about it, but he was also talking about how do you build your investment strategy around this observation. Another guy who I talked to, this is the CEO of one of the world's largest fund managers, American-based, he himself is not American. And one thing he sort of did, is sort of a rhetorical thing, which a lot of people in this space who I talked to would do, which is, it's the my friend thinks trick. So they would say, it's not what I think, and I don't really like it, but some of my friends think this. So he was talking about the investment committee of his firm, and this is, in a fund, this is the most powerful place in the firm, deciding where they're going to allocate their capital. And they had been talking also about the hollowing out of the American middle class, what to think about it, what to do about it. And this is what the CEO of that firm said. His point was that if the transformation of the world economy lifts 4 people in China and India out of poverty and into the middle class, and meanwhile, 1 American drops out of the middle class, that's not such a bad trade. Very kind of in that same vein point of view from another person I talked to, and this guy at the time was the CFO, late 30s, multimillionaire, had sold a couple of companies, now was the CFO of one of the leading technology companies, the company I've been involved in business with, and actually a very nice guy. He was born in Taiwan, his parents immigrated, and the parents said to him and his brother this like perfect immigrant line. They said, we will be temporarily poor. Isn't that great? And and they clearly did a terrific job with these sons. They both went to Stuyvesant, which is like the top high school in New York. They now both sponsored a math club at Stuyvesant because they were members of it. They both went on to do degrees in applied mathematics at Harvard. His brother now trades credit derivatives in New York, and he went on to Silicon Valley. He said his mother was so mad at him because he dropped out of his PhD in computer science at Stanford to go work in Silicon Valley. So that's the kind of world, and very much, meritocratic, all that stuff. And I was talking about the middle class, and he said, well, we demand a higher paycheck than the rest of the world. So if you're going to demand 10 times the paycheck you need to deliver 10 times the value. It sounds harsh, but maybe people in the middle class need to take a pay cut. So that was sort of one set of the perspectives. And then the other way of thinking that, and I have to say, I found this frankly really mysterious, but I encountered it so persistently that it's important to highlight, is, believe it or not, a very powerful sense of victimization. I think this is particularly among the Americans, but they are really feeling ganged up on by everybody else and not respected in the way that they deserve. So I'll give you a few examples. One is, and this is an email that everybody can Google to read the whole thing when you get home if you're interested. It's written by a guy called Dan Loeb. He is an activist investor based in New York, multi-millionaire, if not billionaire, in the news recently because he was the guy behind the push to transform the Yahoo board, install Marissa Mayer. So a very smart guy. That, share price has risen more than 50% since he did that. And he was an early Obama supporter. He backed Obama in 2008, gave him a lot of money. But he started to feel, by 2010, he felt Obama was talking too much about how rich people should pay higher taxes. And also financial regulation. And so he sent an email in December 2010 to a bunch of his friends, which quickly became public. And the subject line on the email is battered wives. And it's written in the first person, in the persona of a battered wife. It's quite vivid. It talks about how he tries not to hit me. He only hits me when he can't resist. He doesn't hit me where it shows. After he hits me, he invites me out to dinner. That kind of tone. And the battered wife is the Wall Street hedge fund manager. And the person doing the battering is Barack Obama. So think about that. It's hard for me to imagine, and there are many mothers of my friends, there are many friends of my mother here, so I know a lot of you have actually worked on women and violence. Like, there is no more persecuted person in our society, no more powerless person than a woman who is being beaten by her partner. And there is probably no more powerful person than a rich Wall Street hedge fund manager. But they actually imagine themselves to be battered wives. It's kind of amazing. Similar, lest I seem to be ganging up too much on Wall Street, Silicon Valley example, a guy called T.J. Rogers, who is an entrepreneur, founder of many technology companies, early investor in a lot of others. And I talked to him on video camera rolling, and he said the super rich have become the new persecuted minority in America. And that Barack Obama should feel particularly badly about this because he knows what it's like to be part of a persecuted class, that they are like a racial persecuted minority. I won't even talk to you about the Hitler analogies because everybody says them. So Steve Schwarzman, the co-founder of Blackstone, got into a lot of trouble because at a private dinner they were talking about amending the special tax treatment of carried interest. And this is a particular tax provision, which means that if you're in private equity, you pay essentially a tax rate of 14%. That's why Mitt Romney had the 14%. And there were efforts, and still, that provision still exists, by the way. Obama has been in office now for 5 years. That provision is still there. But people have started talking about changing it. And Steve Schwarzman at a dinner said that effort was like Hitler's invasion of Poland. And people thought like that was just like Steve, because he's known for being quite a vivid talker. But I then did a profile of Leon Cooperman, a New York hedge fund manager, and he said to me not once but 3 times, and again with my tape recorder going, he said, the conditions which led to the rise of Hitler are very analogous to the conditions we see leading to the rise of Barack Obama. And we should be really worried. And I would say to him each time, so are you comparing Barack Obama to? He said, oh, no, I'm not comparing, but the conditions are really very similar. He just couldn't resist. And then finally, to give you a little bit of a sense of the thinking, both the thinking around taxation and the thinking, I think, really even more centrally, and this does come back to the point about meritocracy and really a belief that, you know, we created all this value, we did all these great things. I'd like to read you a few comments that were made to me by Foster Friess. He was a very successful Wyoming mutual fund investor. You may have seen his name in the headlines because he was the big backer of Rick Santorum in the Republican primaries. And I interviewed him last February, and he's very concerned about the deficit. So I said, well, maybe that means rich people should pay higher taxes to help pay down the deficit. And this is his response. People don't realize how wealthy people self-tax. You know, there's a fellow who is the CEO of Target. In Phoenix, he's created a museum of music. He put in around $200 million of his own money. I have another friend who gave $400 million to a health facility in Nebraska or South Dakota or someplace like that. You look at Bill Gates, just gave $750 million, I think, to fight AIDS. I think we should get rid of taxes as much as we can, because you get to decide how you spend your money rather than the government. I mean, if you have a certain cause, an art museum or a symphony, and you want to support it, it would be nice if you had the choice to support it. Where we're headed, you'll be taxed, your money taken away, and the government will support it. And then he started to really get going, more into his theme. If you look at what Steve Jobs has done for us, what Bill Gates has done for society, the government ought to pay them. Why do they collect money from Gates and Jobs for what they've contributed? It's ridiculous. It's the top 1% that probably contributes more to making the world a better place than the 99%. I've never seen any poor people do what Bill Gates has done. I've never seen poor people hire many people. So I think we ought to honor and uplift the 1%, the ones who have created the value. And that's a sort of more, again, also all said on video and everything. That's quite a directly delivered explanation, but I think, you know, scratch beneath the surface, that's a powerful feeling among a lot of these guys. And that, you know, the paradox is that the sense of being a meritocrat actually can contribute to that, you know. The poor people don't hire as many people as Bill Gates. Poor people don't create so much value, so we're the guys who should be honored and uplifted. So, by way of conclusion, you know, what does this all mean? Where do we go? Where does it take us? I want to reflect on a very different period in history. And where I want to take us all is to Venice in the 14th century. And, you know, for those of us who've been to Venice, it's a magnificent place, of course. But actually, when you think about it, it's a terrible place geographically. You know, it's bug infested, it's marshy, the weather is terrible, it floods all the time, even when it's not flooded, it's damp and foggy and terrible. People only ended up in Venice because they got chased off the plains by, you know, conquering more warlike tribes. And yet, by the early 14th century, this totally inhospitable place had become the richest city in Europe. It was 3 times the size of London then, think about that. And it was as big as Paris. It was a huge, you know, it financed many of the military missions, but above all, the vocation of Venice and its power was commerce. These were the entrepreneurs. This was the Silicon Valley of that time. And it was really striking even to people of the time. So Francesco Petrarca, visiting Venice, overlooking the basin of St. Mark, wrote a letter to a friend in the 14th century about these remarkable Venetians. And here's what he said about them. If you'd seen this vessel, you would have said it was not a boat, but a mountain swimming on the surface of the sea. It is setting out for the river Dawn, for this is as far as our ships can sail in the Black Sea. But many of those on board will disembark and journey on, not stopping until they have crossed the Ganges and the Caucasus to India, then on to farthest China and the Eastern Ocean. What is the source of this insatiable thirst for wealth that seizes men's minds? And it is amazing, right? I mean, 14th century. Imagine, you get to the dawn, you get to the Black Sea. That's not good enough. You're going to keep on going to the Ganges. You're going to keep on going to India. And, no cell phones to call back home. But the Phoenicians did it and, accumulated this huge wealth, built this beautiful city we all went to visit. What drove them? We're in a law school, so I have an answer that should be very cheering to all the lawyers here. It was their legal system. They had a form of contract called the Comenda, which was sort of created a joint stock company for a single trading mission. And in something that was revolutionary for that time, it allowed a sharing of the profit of that mission between the person who took the risk and did the work, called the traveling partner, the crazy person who went out all the way to the Eastern Ocean, and the person who stayed at home and had the money, had the capital, called the sedentary partner. But this was an actual contract, shared the risk, shared the profits. So, if you were a risk-taking entrepreneurial, no doubt somewhat crazy Venetian of that period, you could sign a Comenda contract, go out and trade, and if you did a good job, you got lucky, you could become very rich. And this was the thing that really drove that entrepreneurial, that vibrant, that global Venetian society, that wealth. But, an open society with that kind of meritocracy, with all that sort of bubbling up, is great. Once you get to the top, it maybe feels a little bit less great because you have the bubbling up from the bottom. And what started to happen, just as Venice was achieving its peak, is you had the people at the top starting to say, maybe we should change the rules of the game a little bit. And a crucial moment came in 1315 with the establishment, the publication of a book called the Libro d'Oro, or the Book of Gold. And that established a fixed list of names. If you were in the book, you were part of the ruling oligarchy, and if you weren't, you weren't. It was really the end of social mobility in Venice. And it didn't happen all in one moment. There were actually lots of rebellions and protests at the time. But sure enough, there was a simultaneous economic process, and the Comenda system was shut down. And what's really interesting is it's not just historians that see this, but Phoenicians at the time saw that their society was shutting down, was closing off that social mobility and that opportunity. And they actually called what was happening la serata, or the closure. So I thought that that was something good to reflect on for us today. Because, there is certainly a meritocratic, an entrepreneurial, a sort of, social and economic vigor driving what's happening today. But we're also already seeing our own serata is happening. People are already seeing, particularly actually in the United States, that social mobility is really shutting down. The U.S., which prides itself on being this open, vigorous society, has less social mobility than Canada and Western Europe. It's a problem here too. And I just wanted to conclude by, having us reflect a little bit on that.
We have a very few minutes for questions, so
Your students you can be a security.
Here's concentrating the fact that income distribution, few people
Okay, because I may actually see if I can get copies of that. Because we couldn't get anyone in the university to fill on their results.
and is the way it should be. Although of course the health of the society
when it's ends, I'll try and
very much on
get back with you too.
growing middle class and because Bill Pareto, I'm not sure that you know Pareto. you study the income distributions in various places in the world at various times in history, it always came up to the same distribution, no matter the kind of governance that you had. And so you can sit back and say, it has to be that, and a good reason for it. So you've thought that, and what is your comment to the fact that that is a natural order?
So, yeah, so I would make a couple of comments. So, the final social outcomes that we get obviously do differ. And income inequality has become much more pronounced today than it was in the 50s and 60s and early 70s. And that was actually a period when you had a lot of economic growth in North America and Western Europe, and you actually had income inequality shrinking. So, you know, governance can change things. I agree, though, with this essential point that, and that's why I emphasized, you know, the Google dystopia, that there could really be, you know, even if we take away all the rent seeking, maybe there is something about the innate economic forces driving this that are creating that distribution. And I do think it's important actually to face that, you know, for me, difficult possibility head on. That doesn't mean, though, that it is going to be consistent with mass democracy, right? Louis Brandeis said, you know, we can have democracy or we can have very great concentrations of wealth, but we can't have both. And for me, an important parallel to bear in mind is the Industrial Revolution. And you did see, in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, another sort of surge in income inequality. And, you know, when I talk to city economists about this and refer to the Industrial Revolution, a lot of them would say, and I'll quote one specifically, Glenn Hubbard, who's at the Columbia Business School, and he said, you know, yeah, I am worried about income inequality, but let's think about the Industrial Revolution. And after all, didn't that all work out? I mean, aren't we glad the Industrial Revolution happened? Which I think we are. But what that overlooks, and that, you know, maybe that sort of Pareto, this is the natural order of things kind of prism overlooks, is to get to a place where the Industrial Revolution all worked out required communist revolutions in Russia and China. It required 2 world wars. It required at least 2 very deep depressions, the Great Depression, but also the Long Depression of the 19th century. And in response to all of that social turmoil and political turmoil, you had this really invention of modern society, the invention of most of the social and political institutions that surround us. And, you know, my very strong belief is actually, you know, we're just at the beginning of this change, especially the technology revolution part. And I think we do need to think very hard about what is going to be the political and the social accommodation. Because, you know, if that Pareto rule turns out to apply, I think that's going to be a difficult society for egalitarian modern democracy to continue to happen. Witness Venice.
We have to whisk Chrystia out at 1 o'clock, so
But
if I could
5 past.
get 5 minutes on.
I have to catch a plane.
Two quick questions. Professor Gail Henderson, and then maybe we can get a question also on the floor from Professor David Kahane. Professor Henderson.
So I think all of the super rich that you quoted from in your talk were men. And so I wondered if there is perhaps a gendered aspect, and particularly to the sense that we should get all the credit for the good things and have none of the responsibility for the downsides.
Okay, yeah, that's a really interesting point. And I actually, when I first did my book proposal, I was going to do a chapter on the female plutocrats. And then I started looking at it, and there are none. No, it's actually really astounding. The only sort of slight exception is China, where there are a few self-made female billionaires. And it is really striking, and it is, you know, it's one of the ways in which the world of the plutocrats is really starting to differ from the world of the middle class. So, you know, in some ways, my shorthand is the middle class is becoming a matriarchy, and the plutocracy is pure patriarchy. You know, all of these guys, none of them do any deals in which women are their equals. None of them have wives who work. Actually, I asked when I was talking to one of these guys, a private equity guy, and he was in my class at Harvard. So we were at dinner party to chat, and talking about our families and what does your wife do, and they met at Yale Law School, so I assumed, like she did something. And they had no kids. And he kind of looked at it like it was the dumbest question on earth. And he said, well, she manages our investments and buys a lot of antiques. But I realized, this is a guy who's making $10 to $15 million a year. And if you're married to a person like that, you really must love your job in order to get up every morning to go to work. So, it is a very, very male world, and I do think that shapes the view quite a bit. I mean, there's a whole separate question, which we have to have a separate conversation with, maybe by Cheryl Sandberg here, about, why aren't women in there? Professor Kane.
So, I'm interested in what, if anything, you discovered about the purchase of arguments for egalitarianism or for obligation to the poor or less fortunate among the plutocracy. And in part that's coming for me from the sense that, as a plutocrat is to me, so I am to the world's poorest, that insulation and privilege, that sense that it's deserved, etc. So I'm just curious, thinking about us or thinking about the plutocrats, where is the room for arguments or persuasion that could actually crack open that extreme privilege?
So, really interesting question, and I would say, first of all, the argument and persuasion and talking part, they love. So the status symbol among today's plutocrats, it is not the yacht, it is not the private jet, it is your own think tank. That is like the prime top thing. Any plutocrat worth his salt is setting one up. He probably has a flagship conference. It's really a flagship conference. This is where former presidents and prime ministers can make their money by being speakers at these events. There's a Ukrainian plutocrat who has had Bill Clinton and Tony Blair speak at the same conference. So, they love to talk about this stuff. And I don't want to trivialize that. They take that talk very seriously. Second sort of slightly qualifying thing, though, is there is a way in which I think the globalization of the plutocrats can make that direct connection more tenuous. And in some ways, it's sort of almost intellectually easier to think about the poorest people in the world very far away from you. And I do see that a little bit. And then just the final thing I would say is, and this, I guess is a point that's true of all of us, I think there are lots and lots of these guys who are very open to talking about egalitarianism, to talking about social justice, all that sort of thing, and to giving significant amounts of their money in pursuit of that. But when you start talking about something more systemic, that might actually, for example, take their money and give it to the government, as per Foster Friess. When we talk even about carried interest, a lot of the guys in private equity are totally socially liberal. A lot of them have worked in the Clinton administration. That was, some of the leaders of private equity are Clinton administration alums. I have not spoken to a single one of them who does not believe passionately that the tax treatment of carried interest as it currently stands is just and correct, and that it would be a grave injustice and persecution of them to change it. They really think it is. So I guess it's that's where the big disconnect is, right? It's not so much, your obligation as a private citizen towards the less fortunate. They love all that stuff. But if you start talking about, well, maybe we should do something a little bit different with the system. Maybe the tax treatment should be different. Maybe we should regulate banks differently. Maybe Google, by the way, should pay a few taxes in Europe rather than practically nothing. That's where I find, anyway, that discussion breaks down.
Okay, one more quick soundbite question here.
I'll be quick. Much of the information and data you provided on the United States is truly astonishing. But may we hear whatever observations you can really make about Canada, about particularly Alberta and its evolution. Are we there yet?
So the problem here is every single person in this room knows much more about Alberta and Canada than I do. And I don't want to presume, but I can maybe make one or two observations as a very nostalgic and loving of Alberta outsider. One observation is, I do think actually the nature of the Alberta economy and the natural resource base means there is some insulation for a lot of people against the hollowing out of the middle class. Especially blue-collar middle-class jobs. So, it does turn out that being the drawers of water and the hewers of wood is some protection against technology revolution and globalization. Some of those jobs have to be done by actual human beings in an actual specific place. And I think that has a really powerful impact on the dynamic. Observation one. Observation two, one of the classic manifestations of crony capitalism is in a natural resource-based economy. And if you can capture the natural resources, that is a sure and swift path to membership in a plutocracy, and probably the least nice one, right? If your path is inventing a Google algorithm, that's kind of great. If your path is capturing the natural resources, you're more like in the Russian oligarch category. And I think that's a constant political tension here, because the spoils are so great.
Thank you so much, Chrystia. We have a small gift card appreciation, which is a signed copy of Ernest Marshall's book, Justice on the Peace, that has many interesting stories about your grandfather, Wilbur Freeland, your father, and your mother, Donald and Helena Freeland.
Okay, that's great for me to hear, especially because Ernie's wife, Gladys, was my childhood doctor and was threatening to bring naked childhood photos.